There was great worry that the Soviets had developed rather esoteric and unusual methods of so-called brainwashing people. The purge trials...
Dr. John Gittinger was the CIA's chief psychologist for 25 years.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
Alright, welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to cover the CIA-funded MKULTRA experiments that took place in Montreal between 1957 and 1964. If you haven't heard this story, you'll probably find this interesting, and if you have, then hopefully I can show you something new in this video. Often when people hear the term MKUltra, they associate it with wild conspiracy theories. However, this was a very real and well-documented program run by the CIA across North America. You could do a long video just on the MKUltra program. There's a lot of interesting content there, and many others have done this. But very briefly, this program was essentially developed in response to alleged Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind control techniques on US prisoners of war during the Korean War. The CIA wanted to employ similar methods on their own captives and started the MKUltra project in 1953. This program essentially used various methods to manipulate people's mental states and brain functions, largely through the covert administration of psychoactive drugs, mainly LSD, without the patient's consent. This program also extensively used electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and there were many allegations of verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Part of MKUltra's intent was to identify drugs and procedures that would mentally compromise captives during interrogations and force confessions and disclosure of information. The CIA was also interested in manipulating foreign leaders with these techniques. For example, they would make several attempts to drug Fidel Castro. This program carried out many illegal acts, including using US and Canadian citizens as unconsenting test subjects. Beyond using military facilities, MKUltra was carried out under the guise of research at several colleges and universities, hospitals, and prisons. The MKUltra program was halted in 1973, and it has been widely condemned as an egregious violation of human rights and the intelligence community's overreach and abuse of power. Efforts to investigate this program after it was shut down were complicated by then CIA Director Richard Helms's order that all MKUltra files be destroyed, although in the end many documents and files survived. I mentioned that the CIA used various facilities in the US and Canada to conduct their MKUltra activities, and one of those facilities was the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal. This was a psychiatric teaching hospital affiliated with McGill University. Between 1957 and 1964, psychiatric experiments were conducted here under a program led by Scottish-born psychiatrist Dr. Ewen Cameron. Donald Cameron was born in Scotland in 1901 and graduated from the University of Glasgow in 1924. In 1929, he moved to Canada, where he would work at the Brandon Mental Hospital in Manitoba. In 1938, he received his diploma in psychiatry. In 1943, Dr. Cameron was invited to McGill University in Montreal by prominent neurosurgeon Dr. Wilder Penfield. With a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, a sizable donation from John Wilson McConnell of the Montreal Star newspaper, and a gift of Sir Hugh Allan's mansion on Mount Royal, the Allan Memorial Institute for Psychiatry was established, and this would be led by Dr. Cameron. At the time, Dr. Cameron was considered to be a notably humane and progressive psychiatrist. The Allan Memorial Institute was the very first mental hospital to operate with an open-door policy, where patients were allowed to leave when they chose to do so. This was considered to be fairly groundbreaking at the time. Around 1953, Dr. Cameron developed his theory of psychic driving as a method of treating schizophrenia. He theorized that this mental illness could be cured by depatterning, erasing a patient's memories and bringing them to a childlike state. Dr. Cameron thought that the patient's personalities and identities could then be rebuilt using a technique called psychic driving. This method involved forcing patients to listen to taped messages on a loop for an extended period of time. Patients would be sedated and immobilized and then subjected to this treatment for up to 16 hours a day. Typically, a patient would endure 10 days of negative messages, often a message that attacked one of the patient's personality or mental issues, and then this would be followed by 10 days of positive messages of encouragement. Dr. Cameron's research and experiments would soon be noticed by the CIA, who decided that this doctor in Montreal had parallel interests. The CIA's MKUltra program was in full force at this time, and the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal looked like a good place to expand their operations. The CIA would go on to fund Dr. Cameron's research through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology from 1957 to 1964. Dr. Cameron is also thought to have received about $500,000 in funding from the Canadian government from about 1950 to 1965. I mentioned how Cameron's methods of psychic driving to reform a person's mental state involved sedating patients and playing messages over and over, 10 days of negative messages followed by 10 days of positive messages. His program also involved many other, highly experimental treatments to depattern and then repattern the human mind. Besides moderately sedating patients prior to them being subjected to these messages, Cameron would also use Thorazine to put patients into an artificial coma. This would take place in the sleep room, and this drug-induced coma would last anywhere from a few days to up to 86 days in one case. Cameron would often inject hallucinogenic drugs like LSD into the patients while they were in their coma. In some cases, patients were given intense electroshock therapy, sometimes on its own and sometimes in addition to drug injections. These electric shocks were reportedly anywhere from 30 to 75 times higher than the normal power. Cameron also used techniques involving sensory deprivation, and he was quite inspired by the research of Donald Hebb. Patients would have their eyes, ears, and/or skin covered and injected with drugs to keep them in a sedated and paralyzed state. During these experiments, they were also given reduced amounts of food, water, and oxygen. Several of the children who Cameron was treating in the program were sexually abused by several men in at least one case. One of the children was filmed several times performing sex acts with high-ranking federal government officials in a plot set up by Cameron and other MKUltra researchers to blackmail the government officials into providing further funding to the experiments. And because there are limited documents and files available on this case, it's impossible to know the true scope of the abuses committed by Dr. Cameron. Donald Cameron's Montreal experiments under CIA MKUltra funding would come to a close in 1964. During this research program, Cameron and his team would subject hundreds of people to his treatments without obtaining their consent. He undoubtedly caused significant mental damage and deterioration to many people in this program. This was an insane abuse of power against mentally vulnerable people. After undergoing Cameron's experiments, many patients experienced significant retrograde amnesia. Some had to completely relearn skills they had previously, and some were in a nearly childlike state and had to be potty trained and helped with simple tasks. Family members of many patients said that they were even more emotionally unstable than they were before the treatments, and several people were completely unable to live a normal life again. Some people forgot their own children, and one man completely lost the ability to run a business that he had managed for years. One victim that went through this program was named Jean Steele, and her daughter would later state that her mother was never the same after the experiments. Apparently, Jean would sit alone in the dark and write codes on the wall, and her daughter would say that, quote, her emotions were stripped, it took away her soul, end quote. Around the same time as Dr. Cameron's Montreal experiments were happening, other experiments were taking place in other parts of Canada. Female inmates at Kingston's Prison for Women were regularly given LSD treatments. Other experiments were conducted on inmates at the Oak Ridge section of what is now the Waypoint Centre for Mental Health Care in Penetanguishene, Ontario. Additionally, Indigenous youth in residential schools and facilities like the Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton were subjected to various medical tests of vaccines and other substances. Dr. Cameron's CIA-funded work in Montreal would end quietly in 1964, and interestingly, none of his personal files regarding his experiments survived. Shortly after this program ended in Montreal, Dr. Cameron would unexpectedly pass away. He would die of a heart attack while hiking with his son in the Adirondack Mountains on September 8th of 1967. The greater MKUltra project would officially end in 1973. In 1975, the public was informed about the extent of CIA abuses after being investigated by the U.S. Senate's Church Committee. The Church Committee was tasked with the investigation of, quote, the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any agency of the federal government. During a 1977 Senate hearing on MKUltra, Senator Ted Kennedy called for the release of all documents pertaining to the program. And overall, the shocking revelations into MKUltra by this committee made this program public knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, in 1973, as the program was ended, then CIA Director Richard Helms ordered that all MKUltra files be destroyed. Many files ended up being saved, but a lot of information was lost, and it's hard to know the full scope of its operations. And obviously, this file destruction by the CIA significantly hampered government investigations into the program. Canadians first widely heard about MKUltra and the Montreal experiments in an episode of the CBC documentary series The Fifth Estate in 1980. This documentary featured two patients who had undergone treatment in Montreal, and it was also revealed in this documentary that Ottawa had helped suppress information that CIA officials had apologized to the Canadian government following the initial public revelation of MKUltra. In the mid-1980s, the directors of the Allan Memorial Institute defended Dr. Cameron's actions, stating that during the 50s and 60s, psychiatrists were not required to inform patients of experiments and treatments, and that proper guidelines around consent had not been fully developed. In 1988, a group of victims won a class action lawsuit against the CIA, receiving $67,000 each. In 1992, over 300 people applied for compensation from the Canadian government over their involvement in the experiments. Only 77 people were awarded compensation. The other victims were denied because, quote, they were not tortured enough, they applied too late, or they couldn't produce medical records, end quote. At the time, then Justice Minister Kim Campbell refused to accept liability on behalf of the government. In recent times, victims and/or their families have been compensated in certain cases, but on the condition that they sign strict confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. In 2017, the Canadian government reached an out-of-court settlement for $100,000 with Alison Steele, the daughter of Gene Steele, who I previously mentioned. Gene Steele had undergone significant experiments by Cameron, and she had mentally deteriorated after this. Alison Steele was awarded a large settlement on the conditions that she drop her legal case and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Stories related to the aftermath of the Montreal experiments definitely pop up from time to time, but overall it definitely seems to me that this story has been underreported in Canada. To this day, neither the Canadian government nor the CIA have formally apologized for MKUltra and the Montreal experiments done under Dr. Cameron. As I mentioned earlier, none of Dr. Cameron's personal files on the Montreal experiment survived, and the CIA actively worked to destroy documentation and files on MKUltra after the program was ended. And so we don't know the full scope of what happened during the Montreal experiments, but what we do know is very disturbing. And around the same time that this was happening, there were other and sometimes similar experiments and tests being done on vulnerable and captive patients across Canada. And I'm going to cover some of those stories in future videos. I hope you found this one interesting and informative, and if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I typically upload something new at least once a week, and I have a ton of new videos coming up this year. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, and there is a link to that below. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.